Okay, so the argument analyses for the arguments for the first argument analysis have been posted. I posted them just this morning. So take a look. They're on the Blackboard. There's two. They're both editorials from the Toronto Star. That's not meant to be an endorsement of the Toronto Star in any way. They're fine. Their editorials are good for this sort of thing because they usually contain an argument. That's not always the case. So editorials, just for some context, if you don't read newspapers a lot, editorials are supposed to be a short argument for a position, usually a normative position, usually the position that we should do something or something ought to be the case. So these are both examples of that. Yeah, take a look. We'll talk about it more once you've had a chance to take a look. I meant to post these 2 weeks before the due date. I think I said I would do that. So on that basis, I'm pushing the due date back to the 9th of November. So you had 3 more days than originally planned. So midnight on the 9th is the new due date for assignment 1. Okay? And you're going to submit it via uTour Submit. That's, there's a link in the course materials to uTour Submit if you've never used it before. You just upload your file. The TAs will comment on it and upload the commented version. And then you can see their comments directly on your file. So that's the plan. Okay? Are there any questions about that? Any questions about sort of like procedures or whatever? Okay. Probably you'll have more questions as you get closer to actually doing the thing. Yeah. Okay, so there's that. The plan for today is really just to do a little bit more on acceptability, and then we'll move into talking about some fallacies. So we'll just sort of pick up where we left off last time. Yeah? Yeah? Yeah. Yes, you do need to provide a diagram. So take a look at the sample argument analyses on the Blackboard. They'll show you exactly what kind of structure that I'm looking for. You provide a breakdown of the premises. You provide a diagram of those premises. Oh, sorry. The diagram is not strictly speaking required, but you do need to tell me how the premises are related. And if you can do that, you can pretty much draw a diagram. Hang on, I'm just going to close these doors. So yeah, I think I said, yeah, the diagram is not strictly speaking necessary, but all the information that would be in the diagram is necessary, so you might as well draw the diagram. Yeah? Okay, so yeah, it goes breakdown of the premises, your way of breaking down the premises, and the conclusion, information about how the premises are related, and then you go through assessing the acceptability of the premises, their relevance to the conclusion, adequacy of the argument overall, consider a counterargument. And that's the paper. Okay, so please do feel free to email me if you have any specific questions about this, or we'll talk about it more in class, yeah? Okay. So, recall last time we were talking about acceptability. This is one of the first things you're going to talk about when you're assessing arguments, the acceptability of the premises. And I put up this list of some reasons why you might find a premise acceptable. And I proposed to go through the first 3 of these and talk about them in a little more detail. Recall, of course, that if something is an a priori truth, that is, you know it without having to observe anything, chances are it's an analytic truth, unless you're Immanuel Kant making a very particular kind of argument. So chances are it's an analytic truth is true based on the meaning of the words or the grammar of the sentence. So I think that's fairly straightforward. Like if something is just obviously true because of the words that they're using, that's why it's an acceptable premise. Straightforward. It has been stipulated. So if you're talking about like what it means to own a home under the law, then they've got some stipulative definition of that. And that's why it's acceptable to use it, because it has been stipulated. And I had other reasons, question mark, because these are all the reasons that I could think of to find a premise acceptable. But maybe there are others. I don't want to tell you that this list is exhaustive and then, be wrong about that. But let's just talk about these first 3 in a little more detail, because they do bear some elaboration. So, one of the reasons that you could judge a premise to be acceptable is that it's common knowledge. And in this context, I want to repeat that like in everyday context, you should be more like Aristotle than Descartes. Remember I was talking about this last time? Descartes got this theory of knowledge that says anything that you claim to know needs to be based on some certain foundational principles. There should be some rock bottom foundational principles that everything that you know is built up from, and that if you don't have that, you don't really have knowledge. You don't really know anything unless you can bring it down to some like ultra certain bedrock principle. And what I said about that was that, you know, that's fine to act that way if you're a philosopher trying to do like foundational philosophy, or you're a mathematician trying to do foundations of math, or like a physicist trying to do foundations of physics. Basically, in any other context, this is just an obnoxious way to act, right? You're just, if you adopt a totally skeptical attitude and say, well, I'm not going to believe anything you say unless you can give me proof of it, well, then you're not going to build any of the common ground that we said was a necessary condition for having a productive argument, right? Having a productive argument requires that you and the other person that you're talking to share a lot of beliefs. And if you don't have that, you don't have the initial premises that you can use to try to convince them of your conclusion. So if you adopt this full-on skepticism, like, well, I just don't believe any of this unless you can prove it to me, even if it's stuff that's common knowledge, you're not going to get anywhere in your debate, right? It's just ill-advised to act that way. So be more like Aristotle. Aristotle said, all right, so where we start from is things that, quote unquote, everybody knows. That's your starting point when you're trying to figure out what you should believe, is begin from common knowledge. Of course, you shouldn't just accept common knowledge. You shouldn't just go like, well, everybody thinks that, therefore I'm convinced, right? That's not, you shouldn't just blindly accept it. So, you know, obviously what's common knowledge changes all the time. You know, it used to be common knowledge that the Earth is flat, and now it's not. So if you didn't allow questioning common knowledge, we wouldn't get anywhere. So, of course, you can question something that's supposedly common knowledge, but you should do it for some reason, right? There should be some reason for doubt rather than defaulting. So it's about your default mode when you're assessing something that's supposed to be common knowledge. Do you default to skepticism, or do you default to accepting it provisionally unless there's some reason not to? And I would recommend the second thing. Be like Aristotle. Of course, the exception to this rule is that if it's a piece of common knowledge that's under dispute, if the argument is precisely about something that everybody's supposed to know, then that assumption is no good to you, right? Unless you, like, if you say, well, everybody knows it, so we can't even have a debate about it, then you're begging the question, which is something we'll get into shortly. So, and, you know, you're probably going to need whatever you're doing, even if you're debating some piece of common knowledge, like I think what everybody knows is wrong and you think what everybody knows is right, I'm probably going to need to draw on a bunch of other pieces of common knowledge in order to make my case. So it really doesn't help you to adopt a fully sort of Cartesian skeptical attitude when you're trying to convince anybody of anything, right? Except in the sort of like really strange foundational contexts, right? Okay, so common knowledge. When you're doing your argument analyses, what I'm saying to you is it's a perfectly legitimate move to say this premise is common knowledge, so I find it to be acceptable. That's a fully like legitimate way of assessing the quality of a premise. Do that move when it makes sense to do that. Don't do that move when the bit of common knowledge is the thing that's being under dispute, or when there's reasons to believe that it might be wrong. And it's up to you to figure out when there are reasons to believe that it could be wrong. I cannot give you a general formula for that, unfortunately. Okay? So one reason to find a piece of or a premise acceptable. Another reason would be that it's the result of the scientific process, that it's scientific knowledge. Usually you regard that as reliable. So if you're, especially in the context of like a editorial in the newspaper, you know, the arguments that they're making are probably not any stronger than the scientific studies. So the scientific studies are a good sort of like bit of evidence. But you have to keep in mind that lots of scientific studies get retracted, and lots of scientific studies aren't replicable. So somebody does an experiment and they find a result, Somebody else does the experiment and they don't find the result. It's a replication failure. And that's really, really common, right? It happens all the time. So having a scientific citation is good evidence, but it shouldn't be fully convincing evidence. Yeah? Just to drive this home, there's this recent project called the Reproducibility Project. In the last 10 years or so, they looked at 100 studies published in high-profile psychology and social psychology journals. 100 studies, and they tried to reproduce them all. And they worked with the authors of the original studies, trying to get them exact as possible. They really tried to replicate them. And they found they got replication in about 36% of those 100 studies. Well less than half of them were replicable. This left them somewhat concerned, and rightly so, right? When you see like a citation saying this was proven by Smith and Jones in 1998, you think, well, it's a fact. But this suggests that we should take it a little easy, right? You probably should accept scientific evidence as evidence, but you can't play it like a trump card. You can't play it like, oh, a study showed it, so don't even talk to me about whether it's false or not. Right? That's just not how science works. And it's certainly not the case that it's just one study is enough to show that something's true always and forever. So we should distinguish different grades of credibility for scientifically generated facts, right? So there are really central, well-established facts, and then there's all the rest of it. So H2O is water is a super-duper central scientific bit of knowledge. So much hangs on it that if that turned out to be wrong, like, we would have to question a whole lot of stuff. Compare that to coffee increases or decreases the risk of cancer, which I don't know if you follow science news or whatever, but every other week there's a study that shows coffee increases your risk of cancer, and then another one that shows it decreases your risk of cancer. They have no idea. They really have it's not for lack of trying. There are hundreds or thousands of studies on the health effects of things like coffee, and they just give mixed results. A really wide spread of mixed results. So if you're dealing with something like health or like nutrition or psychology, you really have to act differently towards that as a scientific fact than something like water is H2O. Okay, I did this already, but and it's not just psychology, it's not just nutrition. Similar problems have been found in places like economics, medicine, biology, and even chemistry, right? We've had a rash of these sort of reproducibility crises all over the sciences in the last 10, 15 years. And people are really having to start to rethink their methods, which is good for science, right? This is how science is supposed to work. You try stuff, see if it works, and if it doesn't work, then you change what you're doing, right? This is the whole basis of science, is that they keep improving the method as they go along. Some people can sort of mistakenly think that the method is already perfect and it already only ever produces reliable facts, and that is false. And I have a scientific study to prove it to you. And therefore you must believe me, right? Right. Okay. So, sorry, there's some repetition on these. The point of this is just that the unit of scientific knowledge is not typically one study, right? Scientists don't think that one study proves anything. The unit of scientific knowledge is usually a series of studies or the opinion of a whole discipline, right? And even then they can be wrong. So this is just to say, all of this is to say, hey, if you want to establish a premise in one of your arguments, citing a scientific study is a great way to do it. But don't be confused about the impact of that. Don't be so naive as to say, well, this one study said it, therefore anybody who doubts it is a science-denying moron or something like that. That's just to misunderstand how science works. And one final little thing to keep in mind, science journalism is what I would call an epistemic dumpster fire. It is not a truth-preserving activity as it currently exists. If you read something in the headline of a science news article, I give you like better than 50-50 odds that the study said nothing like what the headline said. And often even not just the headline, but the article itself misrepresents what the study said, because there's a huge incentive for science journalists to make the thing sound more exciting than it was, right? So like the headline says, blueberries cure leukemia. And you get into it, and what actually the study showed was that there's a relationship between an enzyme and a metabolic process, and the enzymes in blueberries and the metabolic process is related to leukemia. Like way, way narrower of a claim. And then science journalists just, I guess not even the journalists, but the editors kind of like slapped this really sensational headline on it. So whatever you do, do not cite science journalism, because that is like a dumpster fire for getting things wrong. It is terrible, okay? So just don't cite whatever you do, don't cite the science journalism thing in your argument analysis, because I'm telling you that that is horribly unreliable. You're much, much better off citing Wikipedia, frankly, than a science news article. Unless it comes from one of the absolute sort of like most reputable ones, so like the Journal of Nature, science journal, the journal associated with the journal, or the sort of like magazine associated with science, those are okay, but like really, really be careful. Much better to cite the study itself, and you should have read at least a little bit of the study itself to make sure that it says what you think it says. Okay. Observation claims. So here's another way that you could justify a premise. Here's a person observing, I believe, some horses. So another reason to find a premise acceptable is that somebody claims to have observed that it's true. Just like with common knowledge here, I recommend that you act more like Aristotle than Descartes. Don't be a radical skeptic. Don't assume the assumption that everybody's lying to you all the time. That's just uncharitable. But of course, also don't naively believe everyone all the time. I don't know where to find the balance there, but like context really determines whether an observational claim is reliable. But I would recommend that you default to accepting rather than rejecting, because people don't lie most of the time, right? Am I just being naive? Like most people most of the time tell the truth, right? No? No? Okay. Okay. Nothing hangs on actually just determining the ratio, but like observation claims. So what I would warn you about is don't just throw out all observation claims. So you cannot say, well, you can't just believe what people say, therefore your observation report is meaningless, because especially if you accept the scientific stuff, because the basis of all scientific claims are observational claims. Like all of the studies ever published, the ground of that claim is that the scientist stood there and made some observation, right? So if you reject observation claims, you have to reject all that science stuff as well. So whenever you accept the result of scientific studies, you're accepting a big list of observation claims made by an individual, right? Or a group of individuals. You believe them. You believe that they observed what they said they observed. You believe that they wrote it down accurately. You believe that they performed their analysis, honestly, and all that stuff. So you can't reject these in general, is what I'm saying. You can't just say, well, no, that's just an anecdote. Anecdotes aren't data, therefore I don't have to even consider this thing that you said. That doesn't work in general. Yeah? Okay, good. Okay, so there's at least three reasons to find a premise acceptable. Yeah? There's more. There's absolutely no way we can go systematically through all of the little bits and pieces of how you figure out whether something is true. I take it that all of you have this as a skill, right? All of you have at least some capacity to sort truth from falsity already. And basically, I'm just asking you to rely on that. We'll go through some of the errors that you can make, but like really, we're into the realm where it's up to you to ask yourself, okay, does this make sense given everything that I know? Is this person reliable? Have they got the right kind of motives for them to be telling the truth? Those are the kind of considerations that you can bring to bear. Yeah. Okay? Sorry, it's horribly vague and ambiguous, but that's life, I'm afraid. There's really not much better you can do. Okay. So I'm going to shift into talking about some fallacies. So broadly, there are two approaches to assessing arguments, let's say. There's the criterial approach and the fallacies approach. So in the criterial approach, what we're doing is asking what makes this argument a good argument. So what features does a good argument have, and does this argument have them? It's the sort of like positive, happy side of assessing arguments. And that's the stuff about acceptability, relevance, and adequacy, right? So that's the criterial approach. That's the main approach you'll be taking in your argument analyses. You just figure out whether this argument has the stuff that makes arguments good, right? And what makes an argument good is that it has true premises that at least raise the probability of the conclusion, right? And they have clear relationships between the premises and the conclusion. Those are the criteria by which you judge an argument to be good. Now, there's another approach, obviously, the fallacies approach, where you identify what makes an argument bad. So a fallacy is an error in reasoning. And note that if it's an error in reasoning, then a premise cannot be fallacious. Fallacious is to have a fallacy in it. A premise by itself can't be fallacious. If you say this premise is a fallacy, I know immediately that you don't know what a fallacy is. Okay? So because a fallacy is a problem in moving from one premise to another premise. There's a problem in your inference, there's a problem in your reasoning. That's when we say you've committed a fallacy. The relation between premises is where fallacies can happen. Premises themselves can be true or false. That's it. Yeah? So, and I want to start, we'll do a little bit of this kind of like throughout the rest of the semester, different fallacies. It's a standard sort of like content of this kind of course. I would feel bad if I didn't give you at least some of this. But I want to really warn you about this approach, the fallacies approach, because the danger is that it makes some people really super annoying, like I was in high school. I got my hands on a critical reasoning textbook in high school and started throwing the names of fallacies at people. And it was super duper annoying. And I would consider it a disaster if what I was doing here is training a whole bunch of you to be like I was. I strongly recommend that you don't throw the names of these fallacies at people when you're actually trying to have a conversation with them. You know in like anime when they yell out the name of the move they're doing, like fucking punch. That's what you look like when you use the name of a fallacy in an argument. Nobody would yell out the name of the punch they're throwing in an actual fight. It's not helpful. It's distracting. It doesn't move things forward at all. Similarly, it's very, very rare for philosophers or other sort of professional arguers to use the name of fallacies in their argument because it's usually unhelpful. It usually doesn't help to say the name of the fallacy. I'm going to be giving you the names of these fallacies, partly because I want you to be prepared if somebody throws these names at you. So now you'll know all these things. You will not be thrown for a loop if somebody tries to use the names on you. But like, generally speaking, the name of the fallacy does not move the conversation forward at all. And that's going to be the case whenever you're dealing with an informal fallacy. So formal fallacies are a different sort of breed, right? So a formal fallacy, like affirming the consequent, you say, if A then B, B therefore A. This is a fallacy. This is affirming the consequent. There's a specific name for it, and you can identify this like positively, right? You can say for sure that something is an instance of this, and all you need to know is the form of the argument. So it's a formal fallacy, and you can formally identify it, right? Almost all of the fallacies we'll be talking about for the rest of the class are informal fallacies. What that means is that you can't just identify it by looking at the form. You have to actually dig into the content of the concepts. And what I've been trying to demonstrate to you is that that gets you into the messy world of context. Right? The world of context is a complicated place, but that's where we live. So dealing with these informal fallacies is important. But you can't just say, well, this looks like this fallacy, therefore it's that fallacy. you actually have to explain why it's an instance of that fallacy. And if you're explaining why it's an instance of that fallacy, you might as well just explain the problem and not mention the fallacy at all. Right? That's why it doesn't move you. In the world of informal fallacies, like if you say, oh, you're begging the question, the person says, am I? I don't think I am. And then you have to explain why you think they are. Well, you could have just skipped that step where you say begging the question. Right? Just skip straight to the explanation. Don't yell out the name of your move. Just do it. Okay? All right. And I'm really gonna sort of harp on this fact of the informality of these and the fact that oftentimes it is not clear whether a bit of text is an instance of the fallacy or not. Right? You can be legitimately disagreeing about whether something is an instance of the fallacy or not, and then, once again, using the fallacy name does nothing for you, does no work in getting you towards the conclusion you're looking for. Okay, so we'll do these one at a time, and I'll give you what I hope is a clear example, and then a couple of examples that are unclear to me. So we're going to be doing both nice, neat examples of these fallacies to get you sort of up to speed with the idea, but also examples where I think it's genuinely ambiguous whether the fallacy is being committed. Because I expect more from you than just memorizing the formula and applying it. I expect you to be able to sensitively detect whether you have a clean example or not, and explain what would make it an example and what would make it not an example. Okay? Really, like this is stuff that's badly mishandled in introductory courses like this all the time because they trick people. They trick students into thinking that these are little magic formulas and that you can just throw them at people and end the argument, and that's just not the case. Okay. You can tell I have strong feelings about this stuff because I really did alienate a lot of people in my life by arguing obnoxiously, and this was one of the things that led me to argue obnoxiously. So just the strongest warning I can give you against doing that to people. All right, so fairly straightforward one, inconsistency. So when an argument violates the law of non-contradiction, you said something and you've also said something else, and those two things conflict, that must be an instance of a fallacy, an error of reasoning somewhere, right? So nobody drives in New York. There's too much traffic. This is one of my favorite lines from Futurama. Is that an inconsistency? Seems like it might be. Is there a case to be made that this is not, in fact, inconsistent? Like if you interpret this somewhat hilariously dumb statement generously, is there some way in which you could say, oh, no, actually, that makes sense? Yeah. Right. So if he says nobody drives in New York, there's too much traffic, what he could be saying is, actually, nobody drives their own car in New York. Everybody takes taxis. The full streets of New York are full of taxis, and therefore, nobody who isn't a professional driver drives in New York, right? So even this fairly straightforward case is like, well, is that inconsistent or isn't it? And it depends on how you interpret nobody in this case. So what's the scope of nobody? If you interpret it as no humans, then it's clearly a contradiction. If you interpret it as nobody who's not a taxi driver, which does seem relevant in the context, then it's not inconsistent. Okay. I can't come out tonight. I'm too sick, and also I'm going out with James instead. Is it inconsistent or consistent? Is this an example of inconsistency? Seems like. I would definitely ask for clarification if somebody said that to me, right? You would definitely want to say, wait. Yeah. So is there some way to make, yeah.
Well, it can be consistent, but it's just rude.
Right.
If you're thinking you're going out with James, and you can't go.
Right. So yeah, I can't come out tonight. Here are two separate reasons. I'm sick, but so I'm sick, but I'm also going out with James. So it seems like going out with James, you should, if you're too sick to come with you, too sick to go with James, but like maybe they like James better. He's like, I'm too sick to hang out with you because I have to like put in a lot of emotional energy to put up with you. But really, me and James get along fine, so even though I'm sick, we can hang out, because that's no problem. Yeah?
Maybe like the person has double obligations and one is enough. They're sick, so they can't make it to both.
Good, yeah, so yeah, maybe it's just like, they had plans to hang out with James and then you, and they're like, well, I'm too sick, I can only do one of these things. Right, yeah.
The person communicating to could have a weakened immune system.
Right, okay.
James could be fine.
Good, good, yeah, so it's not that I'm too sick for you, or for me, it's I'm too sick for you, therefore, James, who's got a robust immune system, can handle it. Good. I thought, like, okay, so, yeah. Okay. usually, if you're going to the hospital, you don't say you're going out. You say you're going to the hospital. But hey, no, it's possible. Okay, good. So I think I actually got these out of a critical reasoning textbook as clear examples of contradictions. So this is the problem with the fallacies approach, is that they present you with something that's plausibly interpreted as a fallacy and just leave it at that. If you dig into these things, there's often a way to reinterpret it. Now, if you say X and not X, then you got an inconsistency, right? Like there's some things that you just cannot worm out of. It's like, no, that's just inconsistent. Well, sort of. Yeah, anyway. Okay, so here's another one. Appeal to ignorance. So here's the slogan, and the slogan is, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Good rule, right? Except when it's false. Right? Okay, so here's one. So there have never been any confirmed sightings of unicorns, so unicorns don't exist. Do you think that's, regardless of whether it's appeal to ignorance, do you think that's a reasonable inference to make? I don't know what other basis you would have for believing that there are no unicorns, right? It's that nobody's ever seen one. But what have you done there? You've appealed to a lack of evidence for your belief. Right? Yeah.
Sightings as in alive?
Sure, sure. I mean, like, if there were a bunch of unicorn skeletons around, that would also be evidence that they exist. I take it that neither the remains nor the living unicorns have been observed, unless I've really missed something important. Okay. Okay, so we kind of all agree. Okay, that looks like an all right inference, right? It's not too bad. You might not think it's completely certain, like maybe there could be unicorns, we just haven't found any yet. But it's at least evidence, right? It's at least a reasonable inductive argument. Okay, let's try this one. There have never been any confirmed sightings of aliens, so aliens don't exist. Same structure, the same form, but is this a good inference? Yeah.
The argument could be the fact that we explored pretty much a lot of Earth and unicorns exist.
Right.
The fact is that we've not even explored outside the solar system, so
right.
it's not good enough evidence.
Right. That seems to me what it hangs on, right? So the fact is that if there were unicorns running around, we would have seen them by now. So the absence of any evidence for them is itself evidence, right? Because you have the reasonable expectation that if there were unicorns, we would have seen them. Whereas with aliens, like we've observed to a very close approximation, like 0% of the universe, right? Like almost none of the universe has been directly observed by us. There's quite a lot of it. So like, there's no reasonable expectation that if there were aliens, we would have found them by now. Right? Okay, so is it the case that absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence? Sometimes. What it seems to hang on is whether there's a reasonable expectation that we would have seen it if it did exist. Yeah, this is just the same things I was saying. So you can appeal to a lack of evidence. You can appeal to a lack of evidence for something when it is reasonable to expect there to be evidence of it if it existed. This is not, so for a lot of these, the name of the fallacy is kind of ambiguous. You can appeal to ignorance in the context where, so you can appeal to the lack of evidence for something in a context where there should be evidence for it. That is a valid appeal to inference. Committing the fallacy appeal to ignorance is when, you're appealing to the lack of evidence for something but it's reasonable to expect that there's not going to be evidence for it. So is that fairly clear? Like, the fallacy, the error, appeal to ignorance, is an error precisely in the context where, I haven't seen any aliens, so there's no aliens. It's like, well, you wouldn't have, would you? You Homo sapien. Like, you've looked maybe at a couple of other planets. You've barely started finding new planets outside our solar system. There's no reason to expect that in the vast reaches of space, we would have already run across aliens. Like, SETI's observed maybe 1% of the sky or something like that, right? So our ignorance on that is not surprising, and it's not evidence of anything. And then, therefore, appealing to that ignorance is the fallacy, appeal to ignorance. Whereas with the unicorns, you're appealing to ignorance in a perfectly legitimate way. You're like, look, we don't have any evidence of this, so there's probably none. Okay? Good. All right, here's another one. Begging the question. So, and distinguish this from raising the question. This is something that annoys academics all the time. So distinguish something that raises the question from begging the question. Raising a question is just sort of like, well, this brought up this interesting question for me. And that's not an error, that's just sort of like, how human curiosity works. Begging the question is when you make a circular argument. This is also called a circular argument. You assume the conclusion that you are meaning to prove as one of your premises. Right? That's a problem, right? Because the premises are supposed to be reasons to believe the conclusion. If they presuppose the conclusion, you've given no reasons. Okay. So, I can't believe how much media attention celebrities get. They're not important. And the reply is, of course they're important. They're shown on TV and magazines and on the internet all the time. Begging the question or not? Is that an error? Has this person made an error in reasoning somehow? The second person, of course. Yeah.
The argument is that they are in the media?
Right.
So they're using it as proof against they're in the media?
Okay, so let's say that again. So, like,
the first person saying, why are celebrities in the media?
Yeah.
The second person saying, because they're in the media?
yeah. So, seems like begging the question. The question was about the importance of them. Like, so they are not important enough to warrant the amount of media attention they get. And then the response is, but look at all the media they get. Yeah.
I guess it kind of depends on the definition of important.
Okay, yeah.
Because, like, if second person is saying, like, if they're shown on TV, magazines, like, internet, then they must have some type of importance. And maybe their definition is, like, I don't know, philanthropy or...
Right. Good. So, yeah, like, it's okay, good. So, like, clearly celebrities are important to our culture, right? Like, in some broad sense. Like, paying attention to something, we'll talk about this next week when we talk about relevance, paying attention to something is to deem it at least somewhat important. Yeah? So in the sense that like if you don't know any of the names of celebrities or anything about them, you're missing out on something that our culture generally finds to be relevant. That seems to be true. But in this context, given the thing that the first person said, that what they're denying is that there's some sense of importance, there's a mismatch of importance, right? They're saying, look, celebrities are getting, I can't believe how much attention they get, saying they should get less attention because they're not important enough for this amount of attention or something like that, right? So they're saying, the first person seems to be setting up a sense of importance that's not identical with just whatever people pay attention to is important. If they weren't saying that, then what they were saying would be kind of incoherent, right? They would be making a kind of contradiction in their own claim, because of course celebrities do get, that's how you define celebrities, is they get media attention, right? So the first claim seems to be setting up a sense of importance that is being denied or assumed away by the second person or something like that, right? Okay. Morality is very important because without it, people would not behave according to moral principles. Circular, non-circular, circular. This one's kind of a giveaway, right? So the first two were like a little bit harder to parse out because they hadn't used the same word. If you use the same word in your premise and the conclusion, it's a really strong hint that you're begging the question in a serious way. Morality is very important because without it, people would not behave according to moral principles. Well, morality and moral are just quite equivalent in this context. There's no important difference between the two. So, so who cares if people don't behave according to moral principles, is the reply, right? Like, if you don't already think that morality is important, if what you're trying to establish is that morality is important, if anybody denies that, if you're talking to somebody who doesn't think that morality is important, then what relevance would they attach to people not following moral principles? None, right? If I say to you, I don't think morality is important, you say, well, it's important for morality, then we've made no progress in our conversation, right? Well, we've gone in a little circle. Yeah? Good. Okay, so yeah, the hint is using the exact same word. When they've done that, it'll be fairly clear that they are doing this circular reasoning. It's when slightly different phrasings are used that it becomes ambiguous, right? So, all right, so is this just a weak argument? So I want you to clearly distinguish weak arguments from begging the question. These are two different kinds of problems that an argument could have. Is the following a weak argument, or is it begging the question? So it's okay to lie to authorities if this is in the national interest, because if something is very important for the country to flourish, then lying is acceptable in that case. It is a weak argument. It is a weak argument. But is it also begging the question? No, you don't think that's begging the question? Does anybody want to defend the idea that it is begging the question? Yeah.
It's okay to lie if it's important, because if it's important, it's okay to lie.
Good, good. So that rephrasing really brought that out, right? So it's okay to lie if it's important, because if it's important, then it's okay to lie. When you rephrase it, so that's one of the reasons why you might want to rephrase your premises is to bring out stuff like that, right? So the way that they phrased it kind of hides the fact that this looks to me at least like a purely circular argument. Okay, slight variation. Lying to the authorities is always acceptable if the lie advances the national interest. After all, Kralicki lied to the Senate last year, and now we know his lie was instrumental in saving the lives of government agents. Begging the question, or merely a weak argument? Yeah.
Begging the question or circular argument is providing an evidence for his argument.
Good.
So that is a separate premise.
Good. Exactly. That's the difference. That what's been given here is, here's an example in which it was a good idea to lie to the government. Yeah? And that's different than just saying that it's okay if it's important. Now, you probably shouldn't think that this is a knockdown argument. This is not a great argument because it's one example being used to prove a general statement, right? It's just one case. Furthermore, you don't actually have to believe that they were right, that was the right thing to do. Like, if you're Kant and you think that lying is always immoral no matter what, this wouldn't convince you. You have to be open at least to the thought that maybe lying is okay in some context for this premise to even be moving for you. But it's not quite, so what that makes this is a weak argument, right? It's not a convincing argument. They've way overgeneralized their case. They've failed to convince me that, that lying is okay in some contexts. But nonetheless, it's not begging the question. You're not just going in a circle. You're using a premise that's not that strong to prove a claim that's fairly strong. You've left yourself open to some counterarguments, but nonetheless, you haven't simply assumed the thing that you're trying to show. Okay? So again, to beg the question is to assume the conclusion that you're meant to be proving, and that you should keep this distinct in your mind from appealing to another premise that hasn't been proven or is questionable. Because if you're just appealing to another premise that's maybe a questionable, then further evidence could be brought to bear to show it. Whereas if you're begging the question, you're just sunk, right? There's just no value in that argument because you assume the thing that you're meant to prove. Maybe rhetorical value, or like it might be worth your while to like go in little circles to convince your audience or something like that. People are convinced by circular arguments. Like if you give them the conclusion and then just rephrase it a couple times, people will often be, convinced that, oh yeah, I heard some things, they sounded like reasons. Especially if they already believe the conclusion, you can kind of tap into their biases by just like rephrasing the conclusion. I don't recommend you do that, but that is certainly like a thing that happens. And more or less what I want you to take away from this is going to be the lesson pretty much for all of the fallacies that we're going to look at. This is a frustrating lesson. It's the same lesson that I was trying to show you with the analytic synthetic stuff, like that it's just probably going to be deeply ambiguous in some cases. So sometimes it may not be clear whether a premise is identical to the conclusion or not. And that's the test, right? So if the premise is equivalent in meaning to the conclusion, then it's a circular argument. But you might have legitimate debates about what is equivalent, right? If you've been given two different phrases and you think, like, those are just the same thing. And somebody might disagree with you, say, no, they're not the same. These are importantly different, and I think one leads to the other. Yeah? So that's where this gets weird and ambiguous. Okay. How much time we got? Okay, we've been going for an hour. I'm almost through this, and the only other thing that I have planned is just to do one argument analysis. So do you want to just plow through? We'll take a break and then do the argument analysis? Yeah? Okay, good. Okay, so equivocation, when a word that means two different things is used as though it only means one. So if you're waiting for a sign, this is it. Hooray. All right? The sign, get it? Do you guys get it? You get the joke? It's a good joke. Found it on the internet. All right. So some of these are easy. Some of them are super easy. All rivers have banks. All banks have vaults. Therefore, all rivers have vaults. Hooray. Perfectly deductive argument, right? Well, not really. Actually, so in cases like this, you have a choice. You can either say, this is a perfectly deductive argument with a false premise, or you could say, actually, this is not a deductive argument at all because you've used two different words. So you could say, look, this is all x's are y's. All x's have y's. All y's have z's. Therefore, all x's have z's. So perfectly deductive argument, it just happens to be that one of the premises are false, that all banks have vaults. Or you could say, what you've done here is actually offered not a deductive argument. This is all x's have y's, 1, or prime, all y's, 2, have z's. Now you have to say all, these don't follow, right? So you can't go from this and this to this. All right, another one. Equivocation usually has the structure of a joke, so they're all like at least mildly funny. Criminal actions are illegal, and all murder trials are criminal actions. Thus, all murder trials are illegal. Aha. Take that, justice system. I take it I don't have to explain what's wrong with this. Yeah, like it's fairly clear what's gone wrong. You treated one word as though it has one meaning in two different contexts, when actually the words that you use often have different meanings in different contexts. Mika White says he endured persecution for his beliefs, but an atheist is, by definition, one who lacks beliefs. Okay, so somebody explain to me the problem with that. Here's a hint, they've equivocated. Yeah.
The first part presumes that the belief refers to religion.
Right.
And an atheist doesn't have a belief because, and the second one is the actual word belief.
Right.
So anything other than belief.
Great. So belief is being used two different ways here. One narrowly to mean positive religious beliefs, specifically in a god. And then the second one is being used sort of broadly, where it's beliefs in general, something like that, right? So it's not even that belief has two different, like, it's not even two different words here. It's just two different sort of like scopes of the same word or something like that, right? Yeah? Okay. Sure, philosophy helps you argue better, but do you really need to encourage people to argue? There's enough hostility in this world. A strong argument against taking this class. Huh? I mean, like, here's one that I'm not 100% convinced that this is a fallacy, right? This is my dire warnings to you about not being a jerk with this stuff, is partly because I'm not actually convinced that this is completely wrong. But what's the equivocation here? What's the potential equivocation here? Yeah.
Using argument in the sense of having a verbal fight.
Yeah.
And argument in the sense of you are stating premises that lead to a conclusion.
Good. Good. That's exactly it. Now. Yeah.
Even that can be good argument.
Could what?
But even when we take the words, the way it mean,
Yeah.
even when you're having the argument, you're at least having a good confrontation with someone.
Oh, well, okay, so the claim is that just exchanging ideas and trying to convince somebody is sort of leading into verbal debate. So you have argument as a fight versus argument as giving and asking for reasons. And like, yeah, like they certainly overlap, don't they? Right? It's not often the case that you can get into this. I think I've described to you, there's this amazing place that you can get to where you're having an argument in the sense of this class, and an argument where you and another person disagree about something and you're offering each other reasons to believe the opposite of what they previously believed, but it's not a fight. And it's super cool when you can get there. It's really great. But like, is that what mostly happens? No. No, mostly when somebody tells you that you're wrong, your feelings are hurt, you get a bit angry, you start looking for things about them that you don't like. Like all of the old stuff in your brain starts getting like, you start getting fight or flighty, you start like insulting their clothes or something. Like, so is this an equivocation, or is this a kind of empirical generalization, right? So do we really need to encourage people to argue? And I guess there's a missing premise here that says arguments lead to hostility, and there's enough hostility in this world. Well, arguments lead to hostility. That's not bad as an empirical generalization, is it? Like, you could do worse. So in that sense, this is not obviously a fallacy. If you add in the missing premise that arguments lead to hostility, and you believe that premise is like at least generally true, maybe it's not always, certainly not always true. It's not always the case that arguments lead to hostility, but certainly it happens a lot. Otherwise, you wouldn't need training in argument, right? Like if everybody was just really nice about this stuff, we probably wouldn't need this class. But it's true that oftentimes arguments lead to hostility. So, yeah. This is again, I pulled this off a website about fallacies just this morning, and this was offered as a clear example of equivocation. Clearly, this person has made a fallacy that they've treated argument in two different ways, which should be evidence to you that even the people who are thinking about this stuff think that it's too simple. They think that you can just look at the structure of a thing and say whether it's a fallacy or not, and that's not true in general. Okay. So whether something counts as equivocation depends on whether two instances of the word or phrase are being used in the same way. But sometimes we can legitimately disagree about what a phrase really means, so we can legitimately disagree about whether something is equivocation or not. Okay, and just one more. Sorry, we're going longer than usual, but I believe this is the last one. So when two options are presented as the only options, but they're not the only options. Do you want to donate $15 to feed starving children, or do you hate children? Those are your options. Yeah?
Is this a
Loaded
loaded question?
question. Maybe, but it doesn't have to be a question. So you can have a false dichotomy not in the form of a question. Yeah? Okay. So here's one. So all animals are either mammals or fish. Birds aren't fish, they must be mammals. Yeah? Okay. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by asking you what the problem with that argument is. It should be obvious. Yeah? There were more than two options. You were presented only two options, and therefore there's been an error in reasoning. Either you're with us or you're against us. You guys remember GW? That's good. That's good. I'm not as old as I thought. All right. Here's one where you might have a serious argument about whether this is always a fallacy or not, right? In some cases, if complacency is, like if doing nothing is supporting the status quo, and it's a debate, and the question is, do we fight against the status quo or don't we? Then this might be true. Right? So like, you don't get to opt out of some fights. Or suppose that there are fights that you can't opt out of, that doing nothing is making a choice. Well, then you're either with us or you're against us. Once again, this is often offered, if you look at stuff about fallacies, this is offered as a clear example of false dichotomy. Clearly, this is a false dichotomy because you can be neutral. It's not obvious to me that that's always the case, right? Like, if there's no neutral ground to stand on, if choosing to do nothing is choosing to support whatever's going on, and then your only choices are fight or not, right? With us or against us. Grim, sorry. And here's the really ambiguous case. You're either bald or you're not. So is this guy bald? Sort of. If bald means no hair and not bald means a full head of hair, then there's a third option, right? You're balding or something like that. There was a question last time about the law of the excluded middle, which says it's never the case that A and not A. This kind of case might be one reason why you might want to deny it. Or cases where you're not willing to accept either of the options. So like the classic one is those nasty questions like, have you stopped beating up your wife or not? Well, I would like a third choice, right? Like I don't want to say yes or no to that question because both are incorrect. Yeah? Okay. So a dichotomy is sometimes real and sometimes it's false. To show that something is a false dichotomy, you have to show that there really are more options than were presented. So that's what it hangs on. Are there more than two options, or however many options are presented, or aren't there? And that's whether it's a false dichotomy or just a dichotomy. Yeah? Okay. Let's take 10 minutes, and then I've got an argument. We'll just practice more argument analysis. I'll hand it out. Yeah? Okay, so come back at 2:18. Okay. So that should be long enough for you to have at least read through it and figured out what the conclusion is. I don't think that's a particularly tough task with this argument, right? The conclusion's kind of written right at the top. So what is the conclusion? Yeah. Euthanasia should not be allowed. Good. Conclusion. Let me just get the spelling of euthanasia right. Euthanasia. I always want to stick an E in there. Euthanasia should not be allowed. Good. And the thing that should jump out at you about this conclusion is this should, a normative should. So you need some normative principles in there to justify that somehow, right? Okay, so good. Now we have to get to, so given this conclusion, we have to break down the rest of it into premises. And once again, I'm going to recommend to you that you don't really go sentence by sentence. So there's at least a few sentences in here that seems to be repeating the same premise a few times. So if you're going premise by premise or sentence by sentence, identifying every sentence as a premise, you'll kind of be misled about the structure of this argument, I would say. Yeah? Okay, so pushing the thing away a little bit, thinking about what the main ideas are. What are some of the premises here being offered here? Yeah. Nearly all pain can be relieved. Okay. Good? Yeah.
Doctors should not have the power to decide if a life is worth living.
Is that in here? Right, so giving doctors the power to decide when a patient's life is not worth living. Yeah, okay. To decide if a life is worth living. Okay. What else we got? Yeah.
Alternative treatments are available.
Alternative treatments are available. Yeah. So, I'm a little worried here. I feel like we're identifying a lot of these sentences as premises. Yeah, I'm worried. I'm worried now. Because we need more premises to connect this to this, right? So maybe the strategy should have been start with things that lead directly to the conclusion. Yeah? Yeah. So, right. Living, alternative treatments are available. Does that lead directly to the conclusion? Kind of, yeah. That's fine. That's kind of is good. Further, hang on. So let's get these down. So we could never truly control. Euthanasia. Okay. I saw you. Yeah. Good. So, yeah. I wonder if that should replace P4. It seems to be saying something related. Yeah.
For P2, in the passage, it didn't say that they should not.
Right.
It says that by giving doctors the power to decide when a patient's life is not worth living could lead to non-voluntary and involuntary.
Right. Right. That sounds right to me. So,
Like, it didn't say it should not. Like, the premise is just saying that it could lead to.
right. And the implication seems to be that they should not, but that's maybe not the move that's being made.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think the premise should say, like, they should not.
Good.
It should, like, lead to, like, euthanasia should not be allowed.
Good. Okay. So that makes sense to me. So opening the door to voluntary euthanasia could lead to non-voluntary and involuntary euthanasia. So yeah, let's. Sorry, like. It's fine. So allowing euthanasia. Lead to involuntary deaths. Let's say that. Yeah? So, a lot of hands here. Yeah.
Before the question, like, I know one premise was there's no right to be killed, and then euthanasia could lead to abuse. Like,
Right.
those two kind of are.
So, yeah, so I think that no right to be killed is a really good one. That seems to be definitely operative here. I think the second one you said might be equivalent to P2. Yeah? Okay, so. All right. So the danger when you're doing this is identifying too many premises, identifying too many parts of the argument as premises, and then you're in a mess when you're trying to see how they all fit together. So if you can simplify in any way, it's usually a good idea. Yeah?
Conclusions we do not allow euthanasia has led to involuntary deaths because they provided the evidence that it has. Could is in hypothetical scenario, but has is a more definitive scenario.
Yeah. Yeah, we could. Do you think it improves it greatly?
I mean, it does, because they've already provided the evidence that it had in the past.
Right. But it does not necessarily evidence that it will in the future, is it?
No, but that's what he said has.
Uh,
Allowing euthanasia has led to involuntary deaths.
right. But again, that's not necessarily evidence that it will in the future, right? Because if you set up a different regime for euthanasia, then...
The argument is bigger, choppy.
So I think the hypothetical is more relevant than the actual here, right? Because what we're trying to say is that if you allow euthanasia, then this bad thing will happen. So that it has happened in the past doesn't necessarily support that conditional, right?
But this argument is trying to do that.
It's trying to what?
It's trying to do that.
Well, what it's trying to do is say what would happen if you did allow euthanasia, right? So it's a counterfactual claim that they're trying to establish. So the could here is equally supported by the evidence, right? So if you say allowing euthanasia could lead to involuntary deaths, and showing that it has is evidence for that. It's the counterfactual that's relevant, though, not just what's happened in the past, right? So currently, Canada has euthanasia laws on the book. People are allowed to have doctor-assisted suicide. I hope that they've set it up so that people aren't dying involuntarily. So the fact that it's happened in the past hopefully doesn't entail that it will happen in the future, right? The question is, could it? Or like, is this a threat? Yeah? Okay. Okay. Geez, I feel like we should start mapping this because we're getting lost. But are there any other big premises in this argument? Yeah.
Could you just use what he said as a dependent relation to that? Like to prove the last this conclusion?
So to prove P2?
No, to state the conclusion. Like allowing euthanasia could lead to death, and then as dependent you put that what he said and then the conclusion.
So
like allowing euthanasia could lead to violent death, and then in 1990 around 1,000 patients were killed without their request, both leading together to the conclusion.
straight to the conclusion? I don't think that works. Because the conclusion is normative. And both of those things you just said were just descriptive. Yeah? So it needs at least something more than that. Were there other, sorry, I saw a hand over here. Is there more premises that we're missing from this argument? There's a couple of bits of evidence for some of these, but maybe we'll fill those in at the end, yeah? Like we were just saying. Sorry, yeah.
There are missing premises.
Yeah, for sure.
So nearly all things can be retained, so there is no need to die.
Right. Good, yeah. Yeah, okay, so let's try to map it and then see where the missing premises are necessary, okay? Does that sound reasonable? I think adding missing premises is good after you've got the main ones sort of laid out, and then you can see where the gaps are, right? Okay, let's try it anyway. I mean, we're sort of experimenting with this stuff. Okay, let's see where we're at with the diagram and then see if we need to fill in some more premises. Okay, so what is supposed to lead directly to the conclusion? I think this is how we got in trouble in the first place. We're sort of adding premises without considering how they're supposed to lead straight to the conclusion. So what's supposed to tell us that euthanasia should not be allowed? We might need missing premises to get there as well. So P5, you have no right to be killed, therefore euthanasia should not be allowed. Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe there'd be a missing premise saying like killing should not be allowed.
It does seem to be like an important part of this conversation. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say with P5, there's a big problem with it because that is not something that's guaranteed. If you say that no right to be unjustly killed,
Okay.
that's a universal right.
Yep.
And then you get the missing premise that euthanasia is an unjust killing.
But if you have it that if you have that as a premise, if you have euthanasia as unjust killing, then you go straight to conclusion, right? That's more or less the conclusion. It's okay so when you're mapping these diagrams, it's okay if not all of the inferences work perfectly. Sometimes the inferences being offered to you don't work perfectly, and that's an important thing to identify. So, okay, so, all right, well, So P5, it does seem to me that P5 is supposed to be leading to the conclusion. So you have no right to be killed, therefore euthanasia should not be allowed. So it's one reason. So if you had a right to be killed, then euthanasia should be allowed. You don't have the right to be killed. Yeah, it doesn't really lead to, right? That's actually a fallacy, isn't it? Right? Well, so now the question is, do you write down the fallacy that you think that they've made, or do you just leave it out as a premise? So one thing we could do is just to sort of leave this out as a premise.
What if we combine it with P1? Both of them independently give us the conclusion.
How's that? P1 and P5? I'm not sure that's true. So nearly all pain can be relieved. You have no right to be killed. How do those combine to give you the conclusion? Yeah, I'm not sure that works. All right, let's leave P5 just leading directly to the conclusion right now. That might be an error in reasoning, but it does seem to be part of what's being offered here, doesn't it? Right? They're saying, look, you don't have a right to this, therefore it shouldn't be allowed. So maybe this is a counter argument. So we might add as a missing premise, if you believe there's a right to be killed, then euthanasia should be allowed. There's no right to be killed. That still doesn't follow, does it, though? So should we keep this in as a premise, or should we remove it as a non-premise? No. All right, let's remove it. Actually, you know what? Let's remove it, because it really is a fallacy. Say you have no right to be killed, so you have no right to own an Xbox. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't own an Xbox, right? Right? Like, it's not a fundamental human right that you have the latest gaming console. Nonetheless, that's not evidence that those gaming consoles should be banned. Yeah.
Can we combine it with P2? So there's no right to be killed involuntarily, so without your knowledge or consent?
Well, there's certainly no right to be killed involuntarily without your knowledge or consent. I think there's a positive right to not be killed without your knowledge or consent, right? I think that's the more plausible claim. Yeah, I don't think that combines. Let's take P5 out. I'm going to go with that. Let's take P5 out, because it really doesn't seem to be doing the work that they think it is doing. It's kind of a counter argument, right? So if somebody believed that there was a right to be killed, this would be saying, no, that premise in your argument doesn't work. But it doesn't really get us to this conclusion, does it? Okay. This was the argument analysis on the exam last semester, by the way. People did okay. All right, so what else we got here? So let's see. Alternative treatments are available, such as long-term hospital care. We do not have to kill the patients to kill the symptoms. Nearly all pain can be relieved. I take it all three of those sentences kind of combine into all pain can be relieved. Yeah? Yeah.
Is P2 just explaining like a consequence of P4?
Yeah. Yeah. That's right.
So do we use both of them? Or?
Nope. Just good. All right. Here's a missing premise that I think we can get at least P4 to connect to the conclusion. Involuntary deaths are bad. Nice missing premise, of course, because I hope everybody agrees that involuntary deaths are bad. If you can avoid it, you should. So involuntary deaths are bad. We could never truly control euthanasia, therefore euthanasia should not be allowed. That sound all right? Yeah. Yes, I think that's sort of implied. We could never really control euthanasia, but maybe we should rephrase it to get that explicit. So, sorry, what? Yeah. I would rather write what I was about to write, though, if you don't mind. Yeah. Euthanasia can lead to involuntary death, which I take it as the content of the slippery slope stuff, yeah? So if you say, if you allow this, then it leads to involuntary deaths. Involuntary deaths are bad, therefore euthanasia should not be allowed. So now we have P4 in a dependent relationship with MP1 leading to the conclusion. Yeah? Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So before we had P5, like there's the right to be killed.
Yeah.
In the article, like it was saying, or maybe you have this premising, like if you have no right to be killed, then a doctor can't decide when you can be killed.
Maybe, yeah. Yeah, so, okay. You have no right to be killed. Therefore, and doctors. Say the second part again? Yeah.
Or like doctors shouldn't have the right to decide when a person should be killed.
But in euthanasia, doctors don't decide because the patient does.
Well, the argument is that that turns out to be false, right? Yeah. So, yeah. No right to be killed. That's got to play it feels like that plays a role, but I'm having a lot of trouble finding a non-fallacious way to connect that to the conclusion. I'm not positive that we've done it yet, right? So, okay. Let's fit a couple more bits into this and see how complete it is. So, can we connect nearly all pain can be relieved? There's a bunch of things in there about that. So how is that supposed to connect to the conclusion? And alternative treatments are available. These are kind of like related, right? So P1 seems to lead to P3 as evidence for it. P1 is evidence for P3. So if nearly all pain can be relieved, then alternative treatments are available. Yeah?
Why can't you just make it dependent to show that because there are alternative treatments, nearly all pain can be relieved, and therefore euthanasia shouldn't be allowed?
That would just be to reverse the order, yeah? Yeah? I mean, so, yeah, it might not be clear. Yeah, actually, okay. It might not be clear which of those is supposed to lead to the other. I take it that alternative treatments is more general than all pain. So one of the things that you get treated for is pain, but that's not the only thing you get treated for. So this looks to me like evidence for this. Yeah? Yep.
Then you could have a compromise to that. If you can relieve of the pain, there's no need to die. There's no need for euthanasia.
Good. So write this in here, MP2. If no pain, no need to die. So P1 and MP2, like that?
Again, with no right to death, couldn't we also add the fact that we would prefer people to be alive than to be dead?
Yes, that does seem to be. Well, I mean, is that captured by MP1?
No, but even when we'd rather have people suffering rather than die.
Sorry, I can't hear you over the talking.
I think the next premise would be that living a handicapped life is better than living no life.
I think that gets over that gets mostly captured by involuntary deaths are bad. Or like, or maybe no, you're right. That's not quite. It's not quite the same. It's not quite the same. Okay, so is that captured by MP2? So like living, if you're not living in agony, it's better. You're better off not dying. Yeah. Maybe that captures it. Like the art here is capturing as much of the argument as possible in as few premises as possible to get the structure as clear as possible. Yeah. Yeah.
So does MP2 like lead to the first premise?
Yeah.
No pain, no need to die, then there are alternative treatments?
Yeah. That's questionable, isn't it? That's questionable. Yep.
I don't know, but I still believe that, like, because there are alternative treatments are available, that's why nearly all pain can be relieved.
Yeah.
There is no pain.
Yeah.
There is no need to die. Therefore, euthanasia should not be allowed. So somehow I still believe that the P3 should lead to P1 and then P2, which then leads to C.
Okay, so let's see what that would look like. Right. So alternative treatments are available, which tells us that nearly all pain can be relieved.
And then the MP2 dependent to
MP2, and then that leads to the conclusion dependently. What do you think of that? I think I would have accepted either one of those, but that does seem reasonable, doesn't it? So P1, nearly all pain can be relieved. If there's no pain, then there's no need to die. Then there's at least no need for euthanasia. Maybe we can use MP1 again. So there's no need for euthanasia. Involuntary deaths are bad. Euthanasia, well, I guess, yeah, so we're back to like, we're needing some principle of like, it's better to be alive in general. So that's good. I mean, that's a, if you've learned nothing else from this class, it is better to be alive.
Couldn't we just say the fact that it is an often concluded treat as many people alive as possible?
Sorry, I didn't hear you because of writing, yeah.
Doctors duty to keep as many people alive as possible.
It's not clear to me that that's in the article, though.
Or the society wants as many people alive as possible. Or wants to cut down on deaths.
I guess so. I guess so. I mean, is that captured by what I just wrote down?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Isn't it just better to be alive the exact reason why that other argument we did about vegetarianism and meat eating was completely wrong?
That's right. That's right. That was the crux of the problem with that argument, is this extremely specious belief that it's better to be alive than dead. Okay. So, that was grim. All right. Okay, we're trying to get P1 and MP2 to connect directly to the conclusion, yeah? And maybe one way to do this is to use MP3 as well. So, nearly all pain can be relieved. If there's no pain, there's no need to die, and it's better to be alive. Now we connect to the conclusion, yeah? All three of these in a big dependent relation. It's hard to get to, so just because something is better doesn't necessarily mean that the opposite shouldn't be allowed. It might be evidence though, yeah? Yeah.
In the argument, though, the reason you wanted to die was because you were in pain. So you're no longer in pain, so you don't need euthanasia.
That seems right. That seems right. But is that a reason to believe that it shouldn't be allowed? It could be that that's the argument being made, though. You're quite right.
For the strongest argument possible, we're trying to construct the strongest argument possible provided in this argument.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just wondering how strong an argument that really is, right? Like, because again, like, it's better to have an Xbox than to not have an Xbox. So we should ban not having Xboxes. That doesn't follow.
Well, you can't even compare life to Xbox.
That's true. That's true. Okay. I don't know. So we're stuck in between deciding, like, should we add parts of this argument that weren't written down to make it make sense? Or should we just say, well, it doesn't make sense, and we'll just represent it as it is? So, yeah, sorry, yeah.
Could you say, like, if there's
Yeah, yeah. I think that's MP2 and MP3 get most of that, right? Yeah. Yep.
This is also said in the argument, you do not have to kill the patient to kill the symptoms. So it's basically saying if the problem is treatable, the reason for you to die disappears. Given there.
I think that's given in MP2. Yeah.
So we can already connect to the conclusion.
Yeah, but again, having no reason to do something is not the same as saying that it shouldn't be allowed.
But then again, suicide is not allowed in our society.
Well, it's legal in Canada. You can't. You cannot be charged with a crime for trying to kill yourself in Canada. It's also, we have a medical system for assisted suicide that hundreds or thousands of people are using every year. So it's not the case that we don't allow people to take their own lives. In Canada, at least. Well, it's a normative argument, though, right? So it's perfectly possible to say, look, you've got it wrong, Canada. You should make this illegal. This should not be allowed. Like, that's certainly that the law says one thing doesn't mean that it's right. So it's not that this is a hopeless case, but we certainly do allow people to take their own lives in Canada. I certainly agree. I certainly agree, and I think that's given by MP3. All other things being equal, it is better to be alive. Maybe we'll just leave you with that thought. I'm sorry. This is, we should have done the God argument. I'm telling you, we should have done the God argument. It's much less depressing. Yeah.
If there's no need to die,
Yeah.
then the death would be, what do you call it, never mind.
No, wait. So you're onto something. So we'll.
If there's no need to die, then killing that person would be unnecessary. So doing something unnecessary, killing unnecessary should be illegal, or unnecessary killing should be illegal.
That sounds right. So we should. So if it's better to be alive, and there's no need to die, then you should prevent bad things that are unnecessary. Something like that. Yeah. Okay, good. So now we're getting to being able to connect no right to die as well, right? So if you've got no right to die, better to be alive, and we should prevent things that are bad, that are unnecessary. Now we have a way to connect these negative arguments to the conclusion. That's really good.
And then you do add the missing premise that death is bad.
I think we got MP3, it's better to be alive. I think it's equivalent. So something like MP4, so we should not allow unnecessary bad things. It's kind of something like that. We shouldn't allow unnecessary bad things. Nearly all pain, so let's see. Nearly all pain can be relieved. If there's no pain, there's no need to die. It's better to be alive. And MP4, we had to give them a lot to make this sort of logically connect, but now, we should not allow unnecessary bad things. That sounds right? Whew, geez, that was a lot of work. And we left out a couple of important premises, right? We left out a couple of the bits of evidence for euthanasia can lead to involuntary death, right? So there was a couple of sentences that were meant to be evidence for that. We just sort of left them out as implied. But, whew. Okay, good work, everyone. Let's call it a day.